together.
Patrick, we are live now.
Okay.
Okay.
Start recording. So, good evening, everyone. And tonight is the first talk, evening talk in this retreat, and what we'll be talking about will be establishing mindfulness. So we've already talked about the fact that what we're doing in this retreat is what the Buddha called satipatthana, and what we know usually as mindfulness meditation or even insight meditation. And this is a particular style of meditation that revolves around what we call mindfulness, which the Buddha called in Pali sati. We've seen that mindfulness in practice is the felt continuity of awareness. So if I ask myself, how do I know that I'm being mindful? It's the experience of the felt continuity of awareness. And when we look at the word itself, sati in Pali, or in Sanskrit, smrti, translated as mindfulness, but literally it means memory. So mindfulness is memory. But the key point is that mindfulness is memory of the present rather than the past. And mindfulness meditation is the practice of remembering awareness. So let's take, for example, the question, am I aware now? Why don't you, as a meditation experiment, right now, ask yourself that question. Am I aware now? If I was a betting man, I would bet that all of you came up with the answer, yes. And that's always the case with that question. But if I ask myself, was I aware just then sometimes the answer might be no. How can you get two different answers for these two questions? The difference between the answers to these two questions shows us the difference between awareness and mindfulness. To get a clear sense of what the Buddha was talking about in terms of mindfulness, I haven't spent much time in Malaysian railway stations, so I don't know if this is true or not, but often in Australian railway stations, there are signs on the wall that say, mind the gap. And if you ask yourself, what is this sign telling me to do? It's telling me to remember that there's a gap between the train and the platform. Now, let's say I'm coming into the station and I look out the window and I see the sign, mind the gap. And then my mind being restless, then I change my glance to something else. I think of something, I look at something, I feel something, and I completely forget about that sign. Let's say 3 hours later, I'm sitting at home and I suddenly remember, oh, that's right. There's a sign at the station that says mind the gap. Now, and that sign is about the remembering that there's a gap between the train and the platform. If I remember this 3 hours later, am I doing what the sign wants me to do? Well, I would suggest no. The sign wants me to remember that there's a gap between the train and the platform in the very action of stepping out of or onto the train. In other words, it wants me to remember the present, not the past. And this is exactly the meaning of mindfulness when the Buddha is using the term sati, memory. Let's take another example. Those of you who drive, have you ever had the experience of driving your car down a familiar route, going to somewhere completely familiar, and you suddenly realize that you have no memory of the previous 3 blocks? You've just driven through 3 blocks of a city street. You've gone through at least one set of traffic lights, and you have no memory of doing that. If you ask yourself the question, during those 3 blocks, was I aware? My answer would be yes, I must have been aware, because if I wasn't aware, I would be dead or seriously injured, or others would be dead or seriously injured. I must have been aware. But if I ask the question, was I mindful? The answer is no, I was not. I was aware, but I was not mindful. This is where we see the difference between mindfulness and awareness. Mindfulness remembers awareness. So those 3 blocks that I was driving down and have no memory of, there was awareness, but it was immediately forgotten. Awareness, immediately forgotten. Awareness, immediately forgotten. What does this remind you of? It reminds me of dreams. And it is classic in the Buddhist tradition to compare life to a dream. And a dream has this quality, unless it's particularly vivid and clear, but often it has this quality of being here but then gone. And so you ask someone, do you dream? And they say, oh, no, I don't dream. But of course they dream. It's just that they don't remember the dreams. So in dream, there's awareness, but there might not be mindfulness. And you know if there's mindfulness, if the next day, the next week, the next year, you can remember the dream. So mindfulness remembers awareness. This is what it does. And it has comes in 2 flavors. It remembers I am already aware. Now we've spoken about this and we've played with this earlier today. I don't have to do anything to be aware. I am already aware. It's just happening. I don't have to do anything to see. Like the screen in front of me, I can see it. All I have to do is aim my eyes towards it and I can see it. I'm already seeing. I'm already hearing. I don't have to do anything extra. So I am already aware. But do I know this? Am I aware of my awareness? And in that example of the dream, or the example of driving down those city blocks without remembering what happened, I was aware, but I was not aware that I was aware. So mindfulness has this extra bit to it. But the first flavor of mindfulness is remembering I am already aware. I'm already seeing. I'm already hearing. I'm already thinking. The second flavor is mindfulness remembers to be aware of this particular thing that I'm doing right now. So for example, when I do a formal meditation exercise, I choose something to be aware of. I choose an object to be aware of. So this afternoon, we were talking about the grounding object. I want to settle awareness in the body. I choose something to be aware of. So if I follow Mahasi Sayadaw's recommendation, I would choose the rising and falling of the abdomen, the movements of the breathing sensed in the abdomen. And then I set myself the job of remembering this for the next 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever. So I'm remembering to be aware of this, my meditation object. The first flavor, remembering I am already aware. We go through this in mindfulness of ordinary everyday activity. So right now I'm seeing, right now I'm walking, right now I'm reaching, right now I'm thinking, right now I'm wanting, and so on and so forth. So these are the two flavors. You can see them in the experience of distraction. For example, let's say that I'm meditating, I'm tracking my grounding object, and then suddenly I slide into distraction. Let's say I slide into thinking. So I'm tracking my meditation object, and suddenly, bang, my awareness slips off into thinking. Have you noticed that when that happens, usually you start being absorbed in thinking and you don't know that you're thinking? Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that you'd be sitting there thinking you're meditating or assuming you're meditating, and suddenly you realize, whoops, I'm thinking. What happened? Has that ever happened to you? So if we look at that experience, the moment that awareness slid away from the meditation object into thought, what happened at that moment? What happens is I forget. I forget that I'm meditating, or I forget my meditation object. So I forget my awareness, or I forget my object of awareness. These are the two flavors. And as soon as I forget, then habit takes over and it takes me into thinking. I'm thinking and I don't know that I'm thinking. Then suddenly I know, oh, I'm thinking. So what happens just then? What happens just then is I remember, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to be meditating. Have you noticed how when that moment happens, and this is the moment that mindfulness arises, when it happens, again, there are two flavors. Sometimes it's simply, I remember my awareness. Oh, I'm thinking. I remember this is what's happening now. I'm thinking. Or sometimes if the concentration has developed to some degree, I suddenly realize I'm thinking, and immediately the awareness goes bang, back to the meditation object. So here I'm remembering to be aware of this, my meditation object. So this is mindfulness. It's memory. It's remembering awareness. What blocks habit? What blocks mindfulness? So what gets in the way of mindfulness? What's the enemy of mindfulness? Now, usually, if you ask people what gets in the way of your meditation, usually what people will say is, well, it's distraction. I try to meditate and then I'm distracted. But actually, the enemy of mindfulness is not distraction. That's minor. The enemy of mindfulness is habit. What happens when we drop into habit? It's like suddenly falling asleep. The mind releases any effort to stay aware, and it slides into something deeply familiar that seems to be happening automatically. So it's like if you slide into habitual thinking, the thinking seems to be happening automatically, I'm not thinking. The thinking is happening to me. That's what it feels like. And so there's a sense of effortlessness, but there's also a sense of dullness when, and this is revealed when we realize that we don't know what we're doing. It's like if you're walking down the street and the mind just slides off into habitual thinking as you walk down the street, blah, 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 blah. And then suddenly you bump into a friend and your friend says, "Oh, what's on your mind?" And you say, "Nothing," and change the subject. And why did you say nothing? It's because you actually don't know the answer to that question. You've actually forgotten what you were just thinking about. Has that ever happened to you, or is this just me? Maybe it's just me. So habitual thinking, any kind of habit, but here we're talking about habitual thinking, has this apparent effortlessness and along with this, a sense of dullness. For the Buddha, this is delusion, basically. The state of delusion has become strongest at this point. In order to be mindful, in order to have the felt continuity of awareness over time, means we cannot afford to let ourselves slide off into habit. And that means that we need a sense of engagement with what is going on right now. We need to be actively engaged with the present. We need, as it were, to have the lights on rather than off. And this involves energy or effort. So mindfulness and energy or effort are always closely linked. If you notice in the Eightfold Path, when the Buddha talks about meditation, he talks about the three factors of samavayama, samasati, samasamadhi, right energy or effort, right mindfulness, right concentration or integration. So you notice that mindfulness and effort are close neighbors. So there's always some degree of energy or effort in the mind associated with mindfulness. To begin with, as we said, awareness is always awareness of something. So to be mindful, we have to be engaged with something in particular. And when the Buddha talks about mindfulness and its practice, he uses language that suggests a direct face-to-face relationship with the object of awareness. So, for example, there's a standard sentence in the sutras when he's talking about someone getting started on their meditation practice. It goes something like, the practitioner goes to a forest or to the root of a tree, sits down, establishes her posture, and then, I've forgotten, sits down, straightens her back, and then establishes her mindfulness directly. Now, this directly is often translated as in front, parimukkam, but it's probably an adverb and it means a direct face-to-face encounter. So mindfulness always has this direct face-to-face relationship. So for example, when we talked about grounding object, secondary object, if I want to meditate, I need to settle my awareness somewhere and keep it there over time, grounding object. So I need to remember the grounding object over a period of time. I'm developing mindfulness with it. Suddenly I'm distracted. Then I realize that I'm distracted. Mahasi Sayadaw says, now note this as your secondary object. Your distraction becomes your secondary object. In other words, I'm meditating, then here there's a distraction, buzz, 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 thinking, 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 and I turn my attention directly to it. Bang, thinking. This is what it is. This is what it feels like. And now come back. So establishing that relationship is always part of mindfulness, a direct face-to-face relationship with the experience. So that quality of engagement is always there. What we are engaged with can change very rapidly from one moment to the next, but to be mindful, we must be engaged directly with something. So again and again, we come back to what's happening now. What's the experience now? What is it now? And this return to the present is a constant feature of mindfulness practice. Loss of mindfulness comes from a loss of this engagement, a loss of this targeting of something, whatever it is. And the slide away from engagement is easy because the habitual is easy. Habits are easy, comfortable, familiar. Even the uncomfortable habitual is easy because it's so familiar. Have you ever found yourself when you've got nothing else to do, suddenly thinking about something quite painful? A habitual thought, something that you often think about, and suddenly, boom, there it is again. And if you stop to think about this is really weird. Why am I thinking about this? It just causes me pain. So why am I so fond of it? It's so familiar, it's easy to do. It actually takes more effort not to think about it. So habit is seductive because it has this quality of ease, because it's so familiar, even if it's uncomfortable. So with mindfulness practice, we try to maintain this sharpness of engagement. And when we do that, we don't slide into habit. As soon as we release this sharpness, then off we go into habit, into our default mode. And when we are in default mode, when we are in habit, you notice that the experience seems old. Like you know you've been here before. I've done this before. I've experienced this before. There's a staleness to the experience. But when we are mindful, the experience seems fresh. It feels new, as if we are doing it for the first time, no matter how many times we've done it. And again, you can see this in driving. Mindfulness of driving is a very good daily mindfulness exercise. Driving to a place you drive to every day, it's very easy for the mind to just slide off into habit. Maybe turn the radio on, let the mind drift. And it feels like I've done this before. This is getting so boring. But if you deliberately mindful during the drive, it seems new. It's like, actually, it's never been quite like this before. Yes, I've driven down this street before, but the experience has never been quite like this. This is one of the characteristics of mindfulness. It's fresh. It feels new, even if we've done it before. So these are some of the qualities of mindfulness that we get to know as we practice. And this sense of being engaged with the experience, this brings us to the problem of effort. Because we need to be engaged in what is happening now, but we also need to be relaxed. And this is very important, because if we are not relaxed, we are striving, and we are to some degree tense. tense in the body and tense in the mind. And this gets in the way of the practice. So our relationship to effort could be summed up as relax and be aware. Now, if we ask, why is relaxation important? And I'll have to give you a confession here. When I was in Burma practicing with Sayadaw U Pandita, he never advised me to relax. He advised me to make more effort. The relaxation came later. Actually, that was a lot of the influence of Sayadaw U Tejaniya. Why is relaxation important? Because when we strive, we lose sight of the obvious fact that we are already aware. Now, remember we said we do not have to try to be aware. We are already aware. But when we're striving to get something, we lose sight of this fact, and this starts to mess things up. So when we make too much effort, what happens? We lose touch with what is actually happening, and we get lost in our concepts about what is happening. So take, for example, that simple exercise we did this morning of holding our hands and feeling the touch of our hands. Now, the job was just feel your hands. Now, let's say I'm starting off on my meditation and the meditation master says, okay, now feel your hands. And I think, this is a trick question. He's out to get me. There's something mysterious about this. I've really got to work at this. I've really got to feel those hands. If we try too hard to stay focused on the feel of our hands or any meditation object, we get lost in our concepts about what this exercise is supposed to be, what I am supposed to be aware of, what this is supposed to feel like. And all of that distracts me from what's actually happening. So meditation teacher says, no, I want you to sit here in a nice meditation posture and follow your breathing for 30 minutes. I'll just go and have a nice cup of coffee and come back later. So, okay, I'm supposed to sit in this special meditation posture. It must be really special. So I've really got to work hard at it. I mustn't move. And the breathing's really important. I just got to catch that breathing. If I can catch that breathing, I'll be enlightened. I've got to breathe now. In, out, in, out. And of course, we completely forget that we're already breathing. What the hell is this about? This is what happens when we make too much effort. So, especially in the beginning of a retreat, it's really important to learn to recognize our own natural awareness. So we're learning, this is why we're having this very kind of gradual entry into the retreat. We're learning to recognize awareness, not fight it, and especially not fight ourselves. So we experimented with this approach in our third exercise. Remember, when we were feeling our hands, but just allowing things to come and go without being too fussed about whether I was continuously with the hands or not. There, the focus was more on the awareness itself rather than the object of awareness. So this is a loosening, a more open awareness, looser approach, where we're learning to recognize our awareness. It's already happening. And of course, this is what we do throughout the retreat in ordinary everyday activities, in everyday mindfulness, which is one reason why everyday mindfulness is so important, because that's when we really learn to recognize the fact I am already aware. So we don't want to fight our awareness. Now, how do we do that? How do I actually fight my awareness? I do that by trying to make something happen. So I have a view or an image of what should be happening. I should be concentrated. I should be staying with my breath. Or I should not be thinking. So I have this image of what should be happening, what should not be happening. And then I struggle to make this image a reality, to turn this view into an actual experience. And this creates tension and conflict, because what I'm doing is there's something happening, but that something is not good enough for me. So I'm pushing that aside and reaching into the future to grab hold of what is supposed to be happening and trying to make that happen. And of course, it doesn't work. All we get is tension and conflict, and the struggle that we're going through hides the fundamental fact that we are already aware. So this brings us to what the Buddha calls right effort or right energy, samma vayama. And coming back to Sayadaw U Tejaniya, I'd like to quote him from his book, When Awareness Becomes Natural. And here he's quoting his teacher, Shwayu Min Sayadaw. He says, don't try to do anything. Don't try to prevent anything. But don't forget what is happening. So it's a very useful thing to remember. Don't try to do anything. Don't try to prevent anything. But don't forget what is happening. So the practice does require commitment. When we make too little effort, not enough effort, our habitual forgetfulness takes over, because it is our habit to forget. In a human lifetime, we've done a lot of forgetting. And this is our habit now. In some cultures, forgetting is seen as a blessing because there's so much pain. We much rather forget it. And often it's a feeling of dis-ease, of discontent, that causes us to drop the awareness of the present and head off into habitual thinking. Has anybody tried to maintain a daily meditation practice over a period of time? Like a week, a month, a year? Has anybody noticed that it's rather difficult? Apparently, there is scientific research that shows that of all human activities, meditation is the easiest to postpone. Why is that? Why are we so reluctant to actually do it? I think the reason is because when we practice meditation, when we are mindful, we open ourselves up to the dukkha, the pain that's just underneath the surface. And we prefer not to do that. We can avoid it by forgetting and drifting off. That's why people love to watch TV. I can just forget about everything except this drama. So we've developed a very strong habit of forgetting. So we need to get over that. We need to counter that. So this requires effort. But when we try too hard, when we try to do something or to prevent something, we're making too much effort. We're separating ourselves from what's actually happening. and trying to reach out and get something else to happen. So we need to look for the balance. By committing to the practice of reminding ourselves that right now something is happening. What is it? So the relationship to the present is absolutely central. And we're going to talk more about this as we go through the retreat. Now, where does distraction fit into this? Distractions are like the weeds of the mind. And if we ask, well, what is a weed? A weed is a plant that grows where we don't want it to grow. Now you notice that there's nothing wrong with the plant. The problem is with our minds. The problem is with our determination that this plant should not be here because some other plant should be here. Distractions are like the weeds of the mind in the sense that there's no problem with the experience that we label distraction. The problem lies in our determination that this experience should not be happening because something else should be happening. That's where the problem is. So as we start this retreat, as we start to get into it, be interested in distraction. Do not treat distraction as your enemy. It's not your enemy. It's the content of your practice. That's what the practice is about. So watch how awareness moves and watch when awareness moves, when it shifts from one object to another, and see how it feels when awareness moves. We start to study our distractions. We'll talk more about this as we go through, but for the moment, let's just look at a couple of little things you could do. So, for example, with mind, when you meditate, are you distracted by thinking? Is there anybody here who does that? Probably not many, because probably only the beginners. There are many experienced meditators here. I'm sure they don't have this kind of problem. But if you do have that problem, begin to notice whether you are thinking about past or future. Now, we've mentioned this just briefly before. You realize you're thinking and just check whether you're thinking about the past or the future. Most of the time, that's what we think about. Sometimes we think about the present, but most of the time we're thinking about either past or future. Some when else, or sometimes somewhere else, like a fantasy world that isn't past or future, but it's just not here. But let's stick with time for the present. So just check and label your thinking as past or as future. Or you could do it as a question. You realize you're thinking and just ask yourself, past or future? Just drop that question in and see what comes up. And don't spend too much time thinking about it. Just drop the question and see what you notice in that moment, and then go back. And start to see if a pattern emerges over time. Now, some people do see patterns. Some people discover that they spend a lot of their lives in the past. And some people discover that they spend a lot of their lives in the future. Then if you establish that, you then start to work out, well, what's the emotion underneath this? Or you might discover something else. You might discover that, for example, you're not so much some when else as somewhere else. So you might change the question to here or there. But you just drop the question in just to see what is it. what happens when I get caught up in thinking. You start to be interested. You start to be curious about your distraction. So distraction is not something that's punishing you for being a bad meditator. Distraction is a door into insight. This is interesting. I can't keep my mind on my meditation object. That's interesting. So what's happening? In terms of the body, for example, when these are other things to try. When you notice you're distracted, check your body. Is your body tensed in any way? If it is, notice it and then relax. For example, with thinking, there are some people who would say you cannot think without tension in the body. If the body's completely relaxed, you can't think. Now, this is an interesting idea, and I'm not saying it's true, but it's really interesting to check out. So you realize you're thinking. Is there tension in the body? With me, I get it up here in the forehead. And often I notice that my head has gone forward a bit. That's an exaggerated move. But there's a shift forward of the head and tension here. And when I notice it, if I relax this and come back up, the thinking drops away. Another one, and this is the opposite. When you notice that you're distracted, is your body relaxed? I'll give you an example which works for me, which I've noticed with me. I've got lifelong asthma, so my breathing is in pretty bad shape, always. So I always find breathing meditation a challenge. And what often happens is if I'm being deliberately aware of my breathing, the breathing starts to get stronger. There starts to be some degree of tension starts to build. And what I find is that if I'm distracted, and the awareness goes full off into thinking, I come back to the breathing and the breathing is completely relaxed. It took a holiday when I was away. And I come back and then as I'm aware of it, tension starts to build again. So does this happen? So when you notice you're distracted, is your body relaxed? If it is, notice this and maintain this sense of relaxation. So why is it that the body tenses when I'm aware of it? That's interesting. See if you can maintain that relaxation. So you may begin to notice how the state of your mind influences the patterns of tension in your body, and how the patterns of tension in your body influences the state of your mind. And you start to see the mind-body interconnection, which is quite important for the development of insight. So these are possibilities to play with distraction. The important thing is not what we are aware of. The meditation object itself is not particularly important. The important thing is cultivating a continuity of awareness. That's the key. That's what this practice is all about. Now, first of all, to do that, we need to become sensitive to the discontinuities of our awareness. If I want to develop the felt continuity of awareness over time, what I need to get to know is how the awareness is discontinuous. If I want to learn to remember my awareness continuously over time, what I really need to get to know is how I forget my awareness. I need to understand that. So we need to notice our distractions. We need to study our distractions. Do not take distraction for granted, but study it. be interested in it. Distraction, I've said, is the content of our practice. I'll go further than that. I would say distraction is our teacher. It's one of our biggest teachers. It's distraction that teaches us what my mind is doing. And even as I understand it better, why it's doing what it's doing. So the most important thing is not what we are aware of, but cultivating a continuity of awareness. To do that, we need to really get to understand the discontinuities of awareness. In other words, distractions. And secondly, while the important thing is not what we are aware of, yet still at a practical level, it's better to have some things as meditation objects than other things. So and we'll talk more about this as we go through, but particularly in the early stages of the retreat, we emphasize awareness of body. It's really important. Now, why this is important, we'll get into later on. So it's very useful to develop your body awareness. And that ranges all the way from your posture itself, how to establish a posture and how to maintain it. That's in the broader sense. And then in the narrower sense, the details of physical sensation as they come and go. And all the way between the two of these. But we'll talk more about this as we go through the retreat. So I think that's enough for tonight. Thank you. So, are we ready?